Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and welcome to another year of Capitalism and Morality seminar. This seminar has run since 2010 and continuously, except for a couple of years of COVID hysteria. When I arrived in Canada in 2003, I did not know a term called political correctness. And I think a lot of other people did not know about this term either. But as time has passed, it has gripped the psyche of Western people, particularly those who are ethnically European. Now, people in the Western world claim to have freedom of speech, but a slight mistake in his speech, like saying something like, a man is a man and a woman is a woman, means that these days you have to apologize, you become unemployable, and your families and friends shun you. In the dystopia that is emerging in the West, you are supposed to be against racism and sexism. You must believe that race and sex are social constructs. I dare say that today on critical social matters, freedom is far more restricted in the West than it is in East Asia. And I spend a fair bit of my time in East Asia. In East Asia, you can pretty much talk about everything that matters. You very likely don't want to complain about their presidents and prime ministers, but does it really matter to me whether I can complain about Trudeau or not, because I really can't change much at that level. In my view, this trend of increasing wokeism and resulting dystopia is a secular cycle. And I know within our echo chamber, we like to think that a blowback is coming against wokeism. I don't think so. I think this secular cycle must end in a disaster for the West. But irrespective of what the future waits for us, we must speak the truth. We must speak from our heart. I want to invite our first speaker, Dr. Walter Block, who has supported this seminar since its first year. He is one of the most influential libertarian scholars, a leading Austrian school economist, and our local guru. He's a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. He's the author of hundreds of articles in professional journals, 24 books, and hundreds of op-eds. He lectures widely on college campuses and appears regularly on television and radio shows. And I'm proud to have written an essay in one of his forthcoming books, which will likely come out later this month. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Walter Block.
Can you all hear me? Okay. My topic is a classical liberal case for Israel. And it's one of the areas where libertarians diverge. And my own career is sort of based on dealing with areas where libertarians disagree with each other. For example, abortion. Ron Paul is pro-life, Murray Rothbard is pro-choice, and I try to deal with that. And another one is Israel. And before I get to Israel, what I'd like to do a little bit of what is libertarianism, because what I'm attempting to do is to apply libertarianism to the issue of Israel. So what is libertarianism? The way I see it, it's sort of like a two-sided coin. On one side of the coin is the non-aggression principle. Don't initiate violence against anyone else. And therefore, libertarianism is a theory of what is just law. What are proper laws? And the only proper laws are the laws that prohibit initiation of violence against innocent people. So we favor laws against murder, rape, theft, arson, kidnapping, fraud, things like that, and that's it. There are no other just laws apart from that. But you also need property rights. as part of libertarianism because I like Jaon's tie. It's a very nice tie. I shouldn't say Jaon's tie. What I should say is I like the tie that Jaon is wearing. Now, suppose I go over and grab it. Have I committed theft? Well, you can't tell. You don't know until you know who owns that tie. If he stole it from me yesterday, I'm just repossessing it. On the other hand, I never saw the tie before. It's his tie, so if I grab it, I'm a thief. But in order to determine whether the non-aggression principle has been violated or not, we have to know who owns the tie. We have to have a theory of property rights. Well, the way we start off with the theory of property rights is who owns this body? Who owns that body? Who owns the bodies of all the people in the room? And there are only several choices. One choice is Jones owns us all. Well, the problem with that is, what's so special about Jones? So we reject that. Another possibility is that nobody owns themselves, in which case it's illegal for me to touch my nose. Because who am I to touch the nose of this person if I don't own this person? That would be assault and battery. And we would all die if we couldn't even eat or do anything like that. So we reject that. The third possibility is we all own 1/8 billionth of everybody. I own 1/8 of a billion of you, 1/8 of a billion of you, and you own 1/8 of a billion of everybody else. Well, that's a disaster, a recipe for disaster, because we'd have to have committee meetings before we decided what to do. We couldn't even have lunch together unless we had a committee meeting. So the only alternative, the only option would be we each own ourselves. And that would be the libertarian view. We start off each owning ourselves. Now, there is a debate among libertarians, if you own it, do you have a right to sell it? That is the issue of voluntary slavery, where people diverge on that one too. Robert Nozick and I think, are the only libertarians who favor voluntary slavery, namely the right to sell yourself. Why would I want to sell myself? Well, if my son, God forbid, had a horrible disease and it cost $50 million to cure him and I don't have $50 million, and Jaon, I'll pick on Jaon, is very rich, and he's willing to give $50 million to my son's doctors, provided I become his slave, well, I value my son's life more than my freedom, so I gain by selling myself, and he values me more than the $50 million, so he gains, as in the case of all voluntary trades. There's mutual benefit, at least ex ante. Okay, so we each own ourselves. Well, we need stuff. We need land to grow crops. We need to domesticate animals. How do we get to own stuff? John Locke, a famous philosopher, said, well, you own yourself, so go out and mix your labor with the land, homestead it, cut down a tree, get rid of the rocks, put in a corn plant, whatever it is, and then you get to own the land. Now, there is a continuum problem. What's a continuum problem? What's the statutory rape age? We know that if you go to bed with a 5-year-old girl, you're a statutory rapist. If you go to bed with a 25-year-old woman, you're not a statutory rapist if she agrees. Well, where do you draw the line? 15, 16, 17, 18, 14? I don't know. And there's no way to deduce from the non-aggression principle in private property rights what should be the exact age of statutory rape. So it's a continuum problem. I'm now going to punch this gentleman over here in the gray shirt. Does he have a right to shoot me in self-defense? No, because in this context, he knows I'm not going to punch him. On the other hand, if it's a dark alley and the light glints off of my wristwatch, then he has a right to shoot me. Well, where do you draw the line? Well, it's a continuum. So the idea of homesteading is a continuum. How many years do you have to homestead for? How intensively do you have to homestead? Do you have to put a plant every square foot, every square yard, every square acre, every square mile? Barry Rothbard said, well, east of the Mississippi, it's more fertile, so you don't have to, you don't need that much land. And he said 160 acres is good enough for a family of 4. West of the Mississippi, it's less fertile, so you can get more land. Do the Indians own the whole country? Well, right now, if you take a plane from New York to Los Angeles, east of the Mississippi, there'll be lights down there at night. west of Mississippi, except for Denver, there's no lights. The place is empty. The U.S. and Canada are virtually empty. I mean, Canada is sort of like Chile on its side. There's population near the U.S., but that's it. And there are 360 million people in the U.S., and the place is empty. How many Indians were there when the white man first came? The best estimate is 2 to 3 million. Well, if 360 million can't homestead everything, certainly 2 to 3 million can't. Therefore, even if we adopt this principle, the Indians don't own the whole kit and caboodle. Okay, that's sort of what libertarianism is. And there are several variants of libertarianism. The best variant, as far as I'm concerned, is anarcho-capitalism, which says that government is per se illegitimate evil because it taxes us, and we didn't agree to pay. Well, anybody who demands money from you at the point of a gun, look, they're not going to point the gun at you first. They'll write you a nice letter. Hey, you know, we need the tax money. Did you forget? Please pay. But eventually, if you don't pay, there'll be a guy in a blue suit with a badge and a gun. He's going to come and ask you to come visit him. So the anarcho-capitalist view is that this is coercive. The person perhaps most associated with that would be Murray Rothbard. The second one would be a thing called minarchism, or limited government libertarianism. And here, the government is allowed to have armies, courts, and police to protect people. And the main proponents of this is Robert Nozick and Ayn Rand. The third level down, because the more government is allowed, the worse it is as far as I'm concerned. I'm an anarcho-capitalist. The third one would be constitutionalism, Ron Paul, and the way he would interpret the Constitution. And it's a little bit more governmental than the minarchist, because it allows, the US Constitution allows government roads and post offices. And then the fourth one would be classical liberal. And classical liberal, the main famous people there would be Hayek and Milton Friedman. And they allow armies, courts, and police and roads but a whole bunch of other things, a little bit of welfare, a little bit of regulation, antitrust. And those are the four main groupings of libertarianism. Why do I go into this? Because the title of the book on the basis of which I'm giving my talk on Israel is, let me see if I got the title, here it is. By the way, I have a co-author, Alan Fuderman, and it's called The Classical Liberal Case for Israel. Well, why didn't I make the anarcho case? I'm an anarchist. Why didn't I say the anarchist case for Israel? Well, Israel is a state. And I would have to be against it. And I am against Israel because it's a government. It's an evil government. All governments are evil. But I didn't do that. What I did is I'm taking arguendo, hypothetically, putting my, I don't know what, my psyche into classical liberalism. Why am I doing that? The reason I'm doing that is because of Murray Rothbard. And now I'm going to read you a long passage from Murray Rothbard's article, where he taught, it's called War, Guilt in the Middle East. It was in his book, journal, Left and Right. I'm going to read this to give you an idea of what I'm against. So here's Murray Rothbard's view, and he's very anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian Arabs. So here's Murray. The trouble with sectarians, whether they be libertarians, Marxists, or world governmentalists, is that they tend to rest content with the root cause of any problem and never bother themselves with the more detailed or proximate causes. The best and almost ludicrous example of blind, unintelligent sectarianism is the Socialist Labor Party, a venerable group with no impact whatsoever on American life. So any problem that the state of the world might pose, unemployment, automation, Vietnam, this party simply says, parrot-like, adopt socialism. Since capitalism is allegedly the root cause of all these and other problems, only socialism will whisk them away, period. In this way, the sectarian, even if his spotting of the ultimate root cause should be correct, isolates himself from all problems of the real world, and in further irony, keeps himself from having any impact toward the ultimate goal he cherishes. On the question of war guilt, whatever the war, sectarianism raises its ugly, uninformed head far beyond the stagnant reaches of Socialist Labor Party, Libertarians, and Marxists. Each from their different perspective, they have a built-in tendency to avoid bothering themselves about the detailed pros and cons of any given conflict. Each of them knows that the root cause of war is the nation-state system. Given the existence of this, wars will always occur. Now, this kind of insight into the root cause of war and aggression, into the nature of the state itself, is all well and good, and vitally necessary for insight into the world condition. But the trouble is that the libertarian tends to stop there in evading the responsibility of knowing what is going on in any specific war or international conflict. He tends to leap unjustifiably to the conclusion that in any war, all states are equally guilty. And then he goes about his business without giving the matter a second thought. No, libertarians must come to realize that parroting the ultimate principles is not enough for coping with the real world. Just because all sides share in the ultimate state guilt does not mean that all sides are equally guilty. On the contrary, in every war, one side is far more guilty than the other. So let us become relevant. And with that in mind, let us examine the root causes of the chronic as well as the current acute crisis in the Middle East. And let us do this with a view to discovering and assessing the guilty. The chronic Middle East crisis goes back, as do many crises, to World War I. The British, in return for mobilizing the Arab peoples against their oppressors of Imperial Turkey, promised the Arabs their independence, and when the war was over. But at the same time, the British government, with characteristic double dealing, was promising Arab Palestine as a national home for organized Zionism. These promises were not on the same moral plane. For in the former case, the Arabs were being promised their own land freed from Turkish domination. And in the latter, world Zionism was being promised a land most emphatically not its own. When World War I was over, the British unhesitatingly chose to keep the wrong promise, the one to world Zionism. Its choice was not difficult. If it had kept this promise to the Arabs, Great Britain would have had to pull gracefully out of the Middle East and turn the land over to its inhabitants. But to fill its promise to Zionism, Britain had to remain as a conquering imperial power, ruling over Arab Palestine. That it chose the imperial course is hardly surprising. We must then go back still further in history. End quote. So Murray's going back to World War I. But then he says we have to go back further. How much further does he go? He goes back to 1903. And that's it. 1903? Come on, give me a break. How old is the Jewish religion? It's hard to tell. I've done research on this, and I'm not sure. The oldest estimate is 4,000 years old. The youngest estimate is 3,300 years old. I'm assuming it's 3,500 years old. How old is Christianity? Christianity, we can pinpoint a lot better. It's 2,023 years old and 9 months and 12 days, or 11 days. We can really pinpoint Christianity. How old is Islam, the Muslim religion of the Arabs? The best estimate there is it started in the 7th century, somewhere in the 6th or 7th century. It's hard to tell exactly. So it's around 1,600 years old. Namely, the Muslims and Islam are the Johnny-come-lately of religion, right? They're only around 1,600 years, whereas the Jews have been around 3,500 years, namely twice as long, give or take. Well, we did say that when you want to justify ownership of land, it's based on homesteading, and the first homesteader is the rightful owner. You can't have the second or the third homesteader being the rightful owner, because I'm the first homesteader, and I mix my labor with the land, and now I own it. And Jayant, I'll pick on him, comes along second. He says, well, he's the owner. No, he's not the owner. I'm the owner. The land is infused with my essence or whatever it is that I'm mixing with the land. So the second person to come along can't be the owner, and certainly not the 15th person. And there are two reasons for that. One is deontological, namely, it's my land, and anyone comes and takes it is a thief. Secondly, on a practical matter, if the latest person to come along was the rightful owner, there'd always be another person, and you'd never have anyone own anything. And we'd all die because there'd be no private property. So I really could stop my lecture here. I could say the Jews have been around twice as long as the Muslims, and therefore, if there's any dispute over land, the presumption is that the Jews are correct because they were around many, many more centuries than the Muslims. But I'm not going to end here. I'm going to keep going. And I'm going to read you a quote before I get into the essence of it. One quote is, this is from Bibi Netanyahu, and I'm very delighted that he wrote a foreword to this book. And what he says is, if the Jews gave up their weapons, there would be no Israel. If the Arabs gave up their weapons, there would be peace. Let me read that again. If the Jews gave up their weapons, there would be no Israel. If the Arabs gave up their weapons, there would be peace. Very, very succinct. That's what's going on there. If the Jews gave up their weapons, there'd be no Israel. If the Arabs did, there'd be peace. Let me read you another quote before I get into the essence of everything. Assume that Murray is right. Assume that the Jews have only 5% of Israel. Legitimately. Murray would agree that they have 5% of what they presently have. He doesn't deny that. Here is a quote from an Arab spokesman. We will not sign a peace treaty with Israel, even if Israel should consist only of Tel Aviv. Well, I assume Tel Aviv is 5% of Israel, give or take, roughly. So what the Arabs want is to get rid of all the Jews. They don't want to accord with libertarianism based on homesteading and private property rights. Okay, with those quotes, let me continue my analysis of what's going on here. What are the specifics? When were the Jews there? Well, the Romans kicked them out in 63 BC, 63 before the Christ came along. The second temple was built in 587 BC. The first temple was built in 957 BC, way longer than the Arabs were around. They, again, didn't start up until the 7th century. So this is 1,600 years before they were there. And then when they conquered the place, they put in temples. But those temples came in much after the Jews homesteaded the land initially. The Palestinian area was empty. It's very similar to what happened in South Africa. In South Africa, you'd think that the blacks were there first. No. The Dutch and the British were there first. There were very few blacks when they came. And what happened is that they had a much better economy than the black contiguous states, the north of South Africa. And now what happened is that the blacks came into South Africa in order to get better jobs than they had there. Well, a similar thing occurred in Israel. The Jews were there first. They had better economy than the Arabs. And then the Arabs came in after the Jews were there and took jobs. Now, whenever you mention South Africa, you have to deal with the objection that Israel is an apartheid country. And it's not true. There is an Arab party, and it was part of the previous government before Netanyahu got back in. The Jews got rid of the Kach party. They said it was racist, but they didn't get rid of the Arab parties. The Arab parties are dedicated to the overthrow of Israel. Can you imagine if there were in Canada a party that was dedicated to the overthrow of Canada? They wouldn't allow them in. So not only is Israel an apartheid state, it's almost the opposite of an apartheid state. Then comes the issue of who were the Palestinians? The Palestinians were Jews. They were called Palestinians before 1948. The name Israel was chosen only in 1948, but before that, the Jews were called Palestinians. The Jerusalem Post, founded in 1932, was originally called the Palestine Post until 1948. The Bank Leumi LaIsrael was called the Anglo-Palestine Bank, a Jewish company. The Jewish Agency, an arm of the Zionist movement, was called the Jewish Agency for Palestine. The house organ of American Zionism in the 1930s was called New Palestine. Today, Israel's Philharmonic Orchestra, founded in 1936 by German Jewish refugees, was called the Palestine Symphony Orchestra. The United Jewish Appeal was established in 1939, and it was based on the Joint Distribution Committee and the United Palestine Appeal. So the Jews were there before the Palestinians. Notice when in Murray's quote, he talked about states. He talked about governments. He talked about Britain. He talked about the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. That's okay, because we are now in the realm of governments. We're classical liberals. We're not anarcho-capitalists, arguendo, just in order to adhere to what Murray called for. Remember in Murray's quote, he said, let's eschew anarcho-capitalism, which said all states are evil. Let us now talk about which state is worse. Well, I have two main reasons why Israel is in the right, is righteous in the land claims. One, they were there first, and it was homesteading. I have another reason, and that is, suppose Giant punches me in the nose, and we have a fight. And at the end of the fight, I am in possession of his tie. Don't ask how I got it. I'm in possession of his tie. Do I have a right to keep his tie? I think so. Let me try again. Israel has been in 5 or 6 wars since 1948. Each time the war was started by the other guys. Each time Israel won the war. They always lose the peace, but they always win the war. And when they win the war, at the end of the war, they are in charge of areas that used to be Arab territory. For example, the Golan Heights, the Sinai Peninsula, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, Sharm el-Sheikh. Well, if government A starts a war with government B, and government A is the bad guy, and B wins, and at the end of the war, B is possessing a part of A's territory, well, as a classical liberal, it seems to me that it's justified for them to keep it. Israel should have kept the Sinai Peninsula. Then Israel would be 10 times bigger than it is now. Israel certainly should keep the Golan Heights. Israel certainly should keep East Jerusalem. Israel certainly should keep the Gaza Strip, because they won it fair and square in a war that they didn't start. We libertarians have a punishment theory. And if you initiate violence, you have to be punished. Well, that's true for individuals, but should also be true for governments. Because again, we are now not anarchists, we are classical liberals, and classical liberals look upon governments as legitimate. So the classical liberal case for Israel is based on property rights in the Lockean tradition. They have a right to the land due to their homesteading, and they were there first, the Temple Mount. We go back 3,300 years ago. Anti-Zionism is based on 2 myths, both ultimately pertaining to property rights: massive expropriation of Palestinian Arabs, myth 1, and ethnic cleansing, myth 2. Neither one is true. There was no ethnic cleansing. What happened in 1948? What happened in 1948 was the there were 5 armies attacking the state of Israel, which really wasn't a state. It was mainly Jewish organizations, private defense agencies. And what happened was that the Arabs sent out a message saying to the people there, leave your homes so that we can slaughter the Jews much better. Because if you're there, it'll be hard for us to slaughter them. And the war will only take 4 or 5 days, and then you'll come back. And they left. The Jews begged them to stay. They wanted them to stay. They didn't want to fight, but they left. And now they have the right of return. Namely, all the people who left Israel in 48, and many of them are dead now, but their children are now in these camps all over the place. There were Jews also in the Arab countries, and they left, and they didn't. There's no right of return for them. The argument, the idea here is that look at how differently the Jews treated their people. They welcomed them. And look at how the Arabs treated the Palestinians. They didn't welcome them into their countries. Rather, they had these camps all over the place. And they kept them in miserable conditions to gain pity for them. Then there's the argument that a lot of the Jewish land titles were illegitimate. They were based on Turkish land titles. Well, and Jews were attacked, and the statement was, well, the supposed Jewish land is based on Turkish land titles. The Turkish land titles are illegitimate, and therefore the Arabs should get the land. Well, the argument is, first of all, it's used to justify Arab ownership. Second, it was the only legal way to buy property at the time. Third, it had limited validity, better than nothing. And fourth, the Arabs didn't homestead the land. By the way, I'm also a critic of Israel. I think, what the Arabs do, when they have a rocket launcher, they put it in the middle of a hospital or in the middle of a school, and then the rockets go over to Israel. What's that? What's that is that the Israelis are too nice. What they'll do is sprinkle leaflets, and they'll say, hey, in 3 hours, we're going to bomb this place because this is where the rocket launchers are. Would any other country do that? I never heard of any other country dropping leaflets instead of bombs. And now they have the Iron Dome. I sometimes regret the Iron Dome. The Iron Dome means that it's an anti-missile missile. When the Palestinian rockets come over from Gaza, the Iron Dome shoots them down in midair so that they don't impact people on the ground. Well, if they didn't have that, they'd have to be a little tougher. They blow up houses? Why should they blow up house? It doesn't make any sense to me. They allowed some refugees back in on humanitarian grounds. They don't have the death penalty for Arab murderers. The death penalty, I think, is justified. I'm now going to kill Jayant. I'm really tough. I can get him from here. What should happen to me? What should happen to me is the death penalty. Why? Because my life is now forfeit. What I really did when I killed Jayant, I hope you don't mind me picking on you, I stole his life. I took his life away from him. Now, suppose there were a machine, and I'm indebted here to Robert Nozick, who's always inventing weird machines, and what you do is you put me, a live murderer, and Jayant's dead body in the machine, and then you flip the switch, and the life goes out of me and into Jayant, and what comes out of the machine afterward is me dead, which I deserve to be because I'm a murderer, and him alive. Would it be justified to compel me to get into that machine with Jayant's dead body? You're darn tootin' it would, right? I stole his life, and we have a machine that'll transfer my life out into him. Certainly we should use that. So that seems to me to be an important justification of the death penalty. The Israelis don't have the death penalty even for mass murderers, Arab mass murderers. Then there's this business of sending rockets over to Israel. Look, suppose Liechtenstein sent a rocket over to Germany. How would the Germans react? Well, the Germans are civilized people. They wouldn't just shoot the Liechtensteinians. They'd call the Liechtensteinians and say, hey, what's up? What'd you do? Was it an accident? And suppose the Liechtensteinians said, no, it's not an accident. We intend to keep shooting rockets over at you because you're evil. Then what would the Germans do? There'd be no more Liechtenstein, right? Well, what's going on there? They're shooting rockets over to Israel. And Israel somehow is afraid to go in there and pulverize them. What they should do is stop it, just what the Germans would do to the Liechtensteinians. Why is Israel like that? They're afraid of world opinion. They're afraid that the U.S. Will stop giving them foreign aid. Well, the U.S. gives more foreign aid to the Arab countries, so if the U.S. stopped giving foreign aid to both, Israel would be better off. I think Israel would be much better off without any U.S. foreign aid. That way, they would fight the Arabs not with two hands tied behind their back, but they would really kick some butt. And there'd be no more continual massacre of Jews. Here's that quote I was looking before. The Arab army message to Palestinians. We have come to you in order to liquidate the Zionists and their state. This is in 48, when they were telling them to leave. Leave your houses and villages. You will return to them in a few days. Leave them so we can fulfill our mission to destroy Israel in the best way so you won't be hurt. So the people who left were aiding and abetting the Arab armies. They were not so innocent. I mean, the argument is, well, I'm going on a vacation or I'm scared. That's a possibility. But this other hypothesis is also a possibility. How would any other government treat people like this? Would they allow them to come back in? No, they would consider them traitors. The Jewish state is racist. That's another criticism. Well, Japan for the Japanese, Korea for the Koreans, Cuba for the Cubans, China for the Chinese, Brazil for Brazilians, but not Israel for Jews? Why should there be such a difference? Why is it racist in that one case when it's not in the other case? Why is the UN always picking on Israel when there are much more greater violations elsewhere? In Israel, they don't toss gays off of the tops of buildings like they do in Arab countries. In Israel, women are allowed to drive. In Israel, women are allowed to vote. In the Arab countries, that's not true. There have been surveys of the Palestinians. They're now talking about a two-state solution. And one of the ways of doing this would be to take all the Arabs who are now Israeli citizens and put them in the new Palestinian state. Guess what? They don't want to be in that state. They'd rather be in Israel. Because Israel treats the Arabs better than the Arabs treat other Arabs. Israel is a civilized country. These other countries are not civilized. What is the Jewish population? Around 7 million. What is the Arab population? 400 million. The Jewish population is 0.001% of the population. The Arab population is the rest of that. In terms of the land mass, it's the same thing. It's less than 1%. So the Jews can't have less than 1% of the land. The Arabs have got to have it all. The Grand Mufti backed Nazis. You don't find any Jews backing Nazis. Rothbard calls upon Arabs to engage in guerrilla war against Israel. Look, Israel is a first world country. That's why they win all these wars, even though they're outnumbered 10-1. It's not really wise for powerless people to depend upon the goodwill of their targets. If I were an Arab leader, I would say, by the way, I was in a debate with this guy, I forget his name, an anarcho-capitalist. His Does anyone remember his name? I can't think of it. I'm sorry? Right, thank you. I was hoping that he and I could somehow bring some sense to the Middle East, but he was not really friendly to this idea. It was more of a clash than two fellow libertarians working together. The 48 War was fought by the Haganah, the Etzel, the Lehi, the Irgun, the Hashemar, the Liamite, and the Stern gangs, or the Stern groups. They were like private groups. I'm out of time. Thanks for your attention. Come on, I've said provocative things.
Hello, Dr. Block. I just wanted to add something. When you discussed the rockets being fired from Palestine into Israel, they're often fired from heavily populated municipal centers. And I'd like to add a point to that. The Palestinian leaders do not live there. They let their people take the hits. They know they're willingly exposing their people to death. They all live in multi-million-dollar mansions on the ocean fronts, far from the city centers, and they're heavily funded with big bank accounts from other wealthy Arab countries.
I'm shocked.
Right. Okay, just a very, very quick one.
Very quickly, we ignore the progress of Israel at our peril. Their technological achievements over the past decade have been stupendous, but also they have a birth rate of 2.9 children per woman, whereas the declining birth rate around the world is precipitously. We're in a demographic collapse. So we look like if we do not support a culture that A, has capitalism, and B, morality, because the birth rate is based on the family. Both of those things will continue to grow Israel, and their technological growth is phenomenal right now. So we better pay attention that we lose a lot if we do not pay attention to the technological development.
Yeah, just look at the Nobel Prize winners of the Jews and the Arabs. None for the Arabs, 20 for the Jews.
Great.
Thanks for your attention.
Dr. Block, thank you very much.